Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanna Cooper. I am an attorney with Nelson and Galbraith. I've been practicing for about 10 years, but I physically sit in our Malden office on Butler Road. I see some familiar faces, some new faces, so looking forward to meeting you all. To kind of get started, just a little zoom out. Just want to introduce Laura. If you've not met her, she's probably a familiar face to you. She is with Title C, kind of the liaison between Nelson and Galbraith and CBC, your point of contact during closing. Laura's great. We're so happy to have her, but just wanted to do a quick introduction there. But today, we're going to talk about covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It is clearly a mouthful, so I'm going to abbreviate it to CCRs. As we go through, we'll run through an overview here in just a moment, but you'll see these called lots of different things. I think on your addendum, your HOA property disclosure addendum, they add a few letters in there. I think they call them CCR, BR, something along those lines. So you'll hear them called lots of different things. They could just be called restrictions. You might hear covenants, but today I'm going to call them CCRs as we go through. So an overview, but before we get started, I know there have been a lot of questions recently about these, so please jump in if you have any questions. I'm going to try to do a good overview, kind of a zoom out and then a zoom in. So if it's your first time exposed to CCRs or something you're very familiar with, hopefully this is helpful for everyone. But again, jump in if you have questions. Our Zoom people, I think you can see a chat. Can they ask questions through Zoom? Yeah. Okay, great. Yep, so please send those over. Please interrupt me as you have questions. So generally, big picture, what are CCRs? So they are a limitation on the use of property put in place by another person. So when CCRs are properly put in place, and we're going to go through specifics on that, the purchaser is voluntarily agreeing to abide by those. Who can put them in place? Well, any owner can. So what that means, they could be created in conveyances. So sometimes way back when you'll see deeds that actually just have language. This property may only be used for residential purposes. Most often, what you'll see for restrictions or CCRs is a separate document filed with the county. You'll hear it called a declaration. Most often, developers, while they own all of the lots in the subdivision, will file those with the county. So again, they're the owner at the time. And that's what you'll typically see, are covenants and restrictions covering a whole subdivision. So lots of lots subject to those CCRs. But again, any owner can just file one on property they own. Now, that's not very common, but it does and can happen. So we'll talk about this a lot as we go through. We know what they are. They're a limitation on the use of property, so that's really important information for the buyer to know. We'll dive into that as well. But how do we find them? Just as a practical tip, all of these CCRs, whether they're included in a deed or a separate document, a declaration, have to be recorded in the county that the property lies in. All of the Register of Deeds are searchable, so you can pull that up if you're familiar with it and search it. Again, they have to be recorded to be enforceable. You can search under the name of a subdivision, under the name of a developer. Again, sometimes they're in the content of the deeds. They can be a little tricky to find. So best way to determine is to do a full title examination, but oftentimes, you're working with a subdivision. There may be an organized HOA. If that's the case, they have to be able to provide copies. And again, they have to be public record. So there's a few ways to find them. Again, generally, for the most part, you're going to be dealing with covenants and restrictions affecting a subdivision that has an HOA. That HOA has to be able to provide those. If not, you can search online through those county records. Rather than going straight to the Register of Deeds, I find the easiest way, particularly for those well-established subdivisions, you guys are familiar with the GIS, you can type in the name of the subdivision on the GIS map, and it will link you to the covenants and restrictions. Now, that's not foolproof by any means, but can be an easy way to access those. So long story short, ask the HOA if it's available. If not, go to the Register of Deeds office. This can be a great time to give us a call at Title C or that attorney hotline. We can pull covenants and restrictions for you as well. But bear in mind, they have to be recorded to be enforceable. And I know that there are some questions regarding amendments and when those are effective, and we're going to go through all of that. So one big question that we get quite a bit, what can they limit? You'll hear people call and say, is this legal that they do this? You know, what authority does the HOA have, or you know, can they limit this? Usually the answer is yes. Covenants and restrictions can limit just about everything so long as it's not illegal. We'll talk about some laws that govern that, but generally most of the laws in South Carolina are governing how the HOA runs. We'll go through a few provisions, but generally there's not a whole lot of limitation on what the CCRs can address. Again, we'll go through the laws, but some of the more comprehensive ones are going to be federal law prohibiting discrimination, things like that. But generally speaking, they can limit just about everything so long as it's not illegal. And the things that are illegal are pretty obvious to kind of point out. So what are some things that you typically find in covenants and restrictions? And if you guys have seen these recently, you'll see some older subdivisions, they might have a page or two, but some of the new subdivisions, and I have a copy that I was going to print out for everyone and decided not to because it's about 60 pages. I'm going to send you an email on this, but a lot of new subdivisions have very comprehensive covenants and restrictions. It is not uncommon to see about 50 pages of these. So don't be overwhelmed if you see them again, that's pretty common. But just a list of some of the things that they might and can address. Garbage cans, use of property, so that may limit whether or not they can have a business run on the property. A big thing that we get a lot of questions about are leases and renters. They may control how many properties can lease or have renters, if any at all. They can talk about landscaping. A lot of them will have architectural stylings or architectural boards that control, you know, projects, what they do and do not do for the outside of the home. They may have limitations on fences, so, you know, materials, accessory buildings, if you can put a shed out back, easements, parking, can you put your boat in the driveway, duties and obligations of the HOA, so it'll tell the HOA how it should be run. It'll talk about assessments, which very important. We'll talk about those a little bit. If you can divide your lots, and some of them go down to even pets. You know, you'll hear the classic, can't have chickens, something like that in the backyard, but some of them will even say can't have more than 2 dogs or perhaps limit a breed. So they can be very comprehensive. So just, you know, a layout here of, yes, they can include a lot, but yes, all of these can generally be enforceable. So it's so important to know these and see them prior to closing. I'm kind of backing up a step or two. We're talking about, yes, most everything is enforceable, what is not. These are the laws that apply to HOAs. In 2018, South Carolina passed what's called a Homeowners Association Act. It's very short. It doesn't give us a whole lot of meat. There are a few provisions that are important that came down. One of those was the requirement to that property disclosure for the sellers, the HOA addendum that came down, so sellers have to fill that out. Talked about recording requirements. We'll go through those. So all covenants and restrictions and bylaws for the HOA have to be of public record. It also went through one requirement for notice. Anyone subject to covenants and restrictions have to have a 48-hour notice before the meeting to raise assessments or dues. Absent that, there's not a whole lot of meat to that Homeowners Association Act. So it's not going to give us any information on, what they can and cannot limit in terms of certain or specific uses of the property. The Horizontal Property Act is also a South Carolina law. This is in place for communities. Generally, the condos will have what they call an HPR. You may see that. It's not very common in Greenville. We do have a few, but you'll see down at the coast there are a lot of these. It's the same thing as, in HOA. They're just subject to a few more laws. That is a little more comprehensive because the HOA, typically in condos, has a lot more authority and a lot more to do. So there are a few more laws kind of tacked on there. In general, HOA, and we'll zoom out here in just a moment and talk about how HOA fits in with, CCRs and what are the bylaws, what are the CCRs, but generally the Nonprofit Corporation Act will govern HOAs. Most of the time, HOAs are organized as a nonprofit organization. So they are run like a business, like a nonprofit. Generally, they don't have to be, but I'd say probably about 95% of them are. So they are also subject to those laws that govern every single nonprofit organization. They are also subject to, and I kind of touched on this, you'll see federal law, the Disabilities Act, Fair Housing Act, Fair Debt Collection Act. So those covenants and restrictions cannot discriminate based on age, race, gender, ethnicity, disability. Unfortunately, particularly here in South Carolina, we will find and see still of record some provisions that violate one of these federal laws. A violation like that does not render the entire document unenforceable. So for example, you'll unfortunately see some abhorrent language on some old covenants and restrictions that may limit what race can move into the neighborhood. Unfortunately, it is of public record. There's not a whole lot we can do at this point about that, but that provision, void, unenforceable, doesn't even exist, but the document itself, all those other provisions may be enforceable. So just because you've got a provision that on its face is void and illegal, again, doesn't render the entire document unenforceable. Now, we try to flag those and go ahead and redact it before we send them out to you or clients, and just something to bear in mind in regards of enforceability. How long do covenants and restrictions last? The general assumption is that the covenants and restrictions are bound to the land and run with the land indefinitely. You may find some CCRs that have a specific time limit in the language of the CCR. So it may say it runs with the land for 10 years. A lot of them will have language, and the language is quite confusing, but it says that they'll renew every 20 years unless they abolish them or whatever the case may be. But generally, unless there is a specified time limit, those are going to run with the land indefinitely. So they're going to be there, which kind of leads you, we'll talk about how to change them and what amendments look like. Now, to zoom out, you'll hear kind of HOAs and CCRs used interchangeably, but how do they actually interact with each other? What does that actually mean? So the HOA is an actual organization or company, kind of run like a business. Again, most often it is incorporated as a nonprofit organization, but it is established to manage the private planned community. So the covenants and restrictions give you the what. It covers what you can and cannot do with your property and spells out the obligations of the HOA company, what they can and cannot do. The bylaws, and we'll talk a little bit more about this because these now have to be recorded. The bylaws, just like any other business or company, give you the how. So it tells the HOA how to operate and conduct business. So again, the CCRs give you the actual limitations on the property. The bylaws, which are now typically just attached to the back of the covenants and restrictions tell the HOA company how to run the organization. I point this out because this is a really common misconception. What if there is no HOA? A lot of people assume if there's no HOA that there are not going to be covenants and restrictions. That is not always the case. They are two separate things. You can have enforceable covenants and restrictions in place on property, even if there is no active or organized HOA. Now, generally, in our big subdivisions, that's not the case, but it does happen. So you do not have to have an HOA for those covenants and restrictions to be enforceable. Which kind of leads you into the bigger question, who can enforce the covenants and restrictions? Most often, when you do have that organized HOA, their job is to enforce the covenants and restrictions. We all probably know that fairly well if you've ever been in a neighborhood with an HOA, but if there is no active HOA, again, those covenants and restrictions, so long as they're properly put in place and not illegal, are enforceable. Every owner that is subject to those covenants and restrictions has the authority to go enforce them through the courts. Now, while that is probably less likely than an HOA sending a letter or putting a fine on a property, you could take your neighbor to court and say, this is enforceable, you can't do X, Y, Z, and the judge is going to tell neighbor they can't do X, Y, Z. I know, neighborly love. But the courts are generally, as you can imagine, not in the business of implying or putting new restrictions on property. So if that does go in front of a judge, they try to read those covenants and restrictions as plainly as possible. So they're not going to read in any implication or add to.
So if you're in a subdivision, if you don't have an HOA, each neighbor can kind of govern through court the entire neighborhood or just their property?
So this generally looks like if you've got one neighbor that is violating the covenants and restrictions, first you could say, hey, neighbor, we've got these enforceable covenants and restrictions. If you can't get them to comply, you could take that in front of a judge for that specific violation. Now, it doesn't happen very often. Generally, when you've got subdivisions with either common areas or architectural review boards, those generally have HOAs put in place, but this still does exist. Now, there may be waivers granted. Anyone that's got the authority to enforce the rules, so whether that be an HOA company or all the property owners subject to, can say, okay, we know this is a violation and we're going to waive any right that we've got to enforce it. Now, that can be very difficult. We'll talk about amending CCRs and what that looks like, but just in a general sense, getting people all in the same place to agree and sign something is hard. So it is possible to get waivers, but practically those can be difficult.
If there's been a continuous violation over a period of time, could that deem the rule to be unenforceable?
Generally, there's no statute of limitations for a suit against enforceability for CCRs, but I imagine a judge is not in the business of telling someone that's been doing this for 40 years to stop doing that. So that would certainly mitigate, how that outcome would turn out. However, no statute generally of limitations, depending on the violation. I think it kind of hinges on that, but again, yes, I think it certainly mitigates the chances of a judge saying you got to stop doing that. Now, this is a biggie, and I know a lot of people have questions about this, and it can be tricky. Who can change the CCRs, and how do you do that? Now, the actual covenants and restrictions will, or rather should, address how they can be amended. Most often, you'll see perhaps they require 2/3 of the property owners to agree. It may have a time limit. They can only do it every 5 years. They all have to agree in writing. So it will spell out all those stipulations. If there is no direction in those covenants and restrictions, generally every single person subject to the covenants and restrictions has to agree and sign off on the amendment. As you can imagine, that is incredibly difficult, even if it is, something that everyone might even agree on. Just to get everyone in the same place to sign a recordable amendment is difficult. But again, most of them, usually either a majority or 2/3 of the property owners can vote or change the covenants and restrictions. Now, one thing that has come up, and I'm going to send you guys a copy of just some, basic, most of the covenants and restrictions are generally the same. You'll see some differences, but I'll send you an example of a recent covenants and restrictions kind of packet with bylaws as well. But one thing that you will see, and this can kind of be concerning, we'll talk about ways to mitigate this when you're going under contract, but a lot of times, particularly for new subdivisions, the declarant, also called, I know this is a lot of text, like 101 of not what to do on a PowerPoint, but the declarant or developer may reserve the right to unilaterally change these. That is pretty common, in fact. Now, the covenants and restrictions themselves will spell that out. Now, this one in particular says they may change unilaterally during a certain period of time if it does not materially change the use of the property. So most of them will reserve the right to unilaterally change for clarification, or perhaps, just policies or new law comes down. So you'll generally see that reservation. A lot of times you'll also see a developer or a declarant, they'll have they call a declarant phase, where the developer still owns lots in the property. They may have a vote that counts for 2 votes. So in terms of amending, they may be able to do that unilaterally because they've got a majority on their own. So this, again, doesn't last forever, but when you have new developments, particularly where the developer still owns some of the lots, they may have the authority to change those unilaterally. Again, read through these to see what they can change, how they can change, and when they can change it, but they probably have some authority to do so. That is a little tricky, particularly if you've got clients going under contract. It could be a situation where you read the covenants and restrictions, they go under contract, and then they could change. That could also be the case after closing. So these, as long as they are properly amended and you're abiding by the covenants and restrictions, doesn't matter if you agreed or didn't agree, you're subject to it. Now, we kind of touched on this, but when are CCRs and amendments effective? The good thing is they have to be recorded with the Register of Deeds to be enforceable, so you can't change things behind the scenes. HOAs now by law have to be able to provide at request a copy of the covenants and restrictions. This is new with that 2018 law as well, but bylaws now have to be recorded with the Register of Deeds as well. Historically, they were not recorded, and again, that kind of gives the HOA the how to run the business, but there can be some important provisions in there. Those amendments are not quite as hard to make as the covenants and restrictions. Again, those will tell you who and when you can change them, which is generally a majority of the property owners or all of the property owners. The bylaws are usually a bit easier to change depending on what authority the board of directors have. Those amendments are effective upon adoption, so long as the HOA has them conspicuously posted or given out to all property owners, and they must be recorded by January of the next year. So you could have a situation for bylaw amendments where it's not yet of public record and they are enforceable or effective, but they have to be available from the HOA or conspicuously posted. So all that being said, I think it's a great combo of two things: to check the public record to see what is filed, and then go to the HOA and ask if there have been any amendments brought up. But generally, at the end of the day, by the next year, everything has to be recorded. Otherwise, it is not effective or enforceable. Now, we'll spend some time on this and kind of focus on our buyer client and the contract. So one really important thing to understand regarding our contract, it states that you're subject to, okay, so buyer acknowledges the opportunity to inquire about owner association issues. So they're already signing, and you can kind of read through that they've had the opportunity to do their homework. So they've had the opportunity to explore. The conveyance stipulations say that seller will give marketable deed, a general warranty deed, subject to covenants and restrictions of record. So once they sign that contract, they are already agreeing to take that property subject to the covenants and restrictions. It is so important, particularly if you have a buyer that, one, you know is going to be very picky about covenants and restrictions, or perhaps they have an idea or a very specific idea of how they want to use the property or what they want to do with the property. Particularly if you're aware of those things, bear in mind that, again, once they sign that contract, they may likely be subject to those already. Now, there is a stipulation, provided they do not make the title unmarketable. Generally, that's pretty difficult to do, or adversely affect the use or value of the property in a material way. So you may have an out. However, I think this is pretty gray at best. You likely, or you do not want to be in a situation where you're relying on this to try to get a buyer out of a contract. It's possible, but could open you up to some type of dispute or lawsuit. So what I recommend, because again, you've got to meet this provision to get out of the contract for covenants and restrictions. So I always recommend, again, if you got that picky buyer, or you've got a buyer that's going to use the property in a specific way, you can create a contingency. I think it's section 28. You can, spell something out. This is subject to review of covenants and restrictions from the buyer. It can be that broad, or perhaps you can put in that specific use. Bless you. So there are ways that you can kind of spell out ways to back out of the contract if restrictive covenants of record pop up that you were unaware of. It gives you an easier out rather than relying on that provision. But generally, again, once you sign the contract, unless you can prove that or create a separate contingency, they may already be on the hook for the covenants and restrictions. Mm-hmm.
What about lawsuits against the HOA or COA? Does the seller have to disclose that, or if they don't, even as found out in the process, is that an out?
Generally, yes, the seller, if they know about it, does have to disclose it. You can, and I think this kind of goes back, you've had the opportunity to inquire about those issues. HOA companies have to tell you if you ask them. So I would go to the HOA company first. Now, let's say they didn't tell you, seller didn't tell you. You may be able to say, listen, this is adversely affecting the value or use of the property in a material way. So I think you've got a pretty good argument to back out if that's the case. But again, you want to be able to prove that you've done your homework. So again, seller, if they have actual knowledge, would include that on that addendum, but the HOA company has to disclose that. Now, this could be let's see. I'm going to skip one and we'll come back to this. How do I make a complaint about my HOA? So in that 2018 law, it talks about the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. I'll call it the DCA, but it gives a lot of authority to the DCA to handle HOA issues. One of the things that they provide is education to home buyers on what they should do before they buy. And they've got some really great handouts, which I'm going to give you guys before you leave. These can be great to share with your clients as well. But this DCA now has the duty to collect any specific data on HOAs. They have to compile them. They have to make them available to you to search, and you can do that through this website. And they have to report them over to the legislators so they can, deal with any issues collectively that they see over and over again. But they do have a voluntary mediation program that you can go through when you want to complain about your HOA. But all of that being said, to pull it back there, HOAs from this law as well, which again gives the DCA the authority to voluntary mediate or report issues. That also now puts the requirement on the HOA to share any information regarding any lawsuits or any issues. So they are required by law to tell you that if you ask. So now this is very interesting. I spent some time on it just going through. You can search any HOA in South Carolina and see if someone has filed a complaint. Now, most of them you'll see one or two, and usually they're about dues, but there are some HOAs out there that have 20, 30 complaints. So if you've got a client that is worried about an HOA or just for your own understanding, you pop that in and see what's going on, if there are any current issues. May or may not be an actual lawsuit, but you can kind of search through complaints. The handouts, and actually I will give these to you now. Great. These are straight from the Department of Consumer Affairs, and it gives you tips or really good overview of what HOAs can do, what laws apply to HOAs, and some tips on what to do before you buy. It is really user-friendly. It can be a great thing to go back to or even to give your clients, but it kind of tells you how to do that homework before you sign a contract, which include going to the HOA, asking for those documents, asking the seller specific questions, and even suggest maybe attending a meeting to see how that goes. But it does kind of give you a breakdown. But again, I think one of the most important takeaways from today is that contract is assuming that you've already done the homework. So the homework falls on the back end, not after contract signing, unless, again, you create those contingencies within the contract that give you an out. Yes?
So I think that's the reason why due diligence would be so good. And then that leads me to the next question is, what kind of liability should we be assuming by providing covenants and restrictions to our clients and maybe not know what has or has not been recorded?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Now, again, the most surefire way is through that title examination. So I would not, you can certainly provide them, but I would stipulate that this is not a full title examination. There may be other documents out there, but I would let the HOA company provide them directly. Now, you can go to an attorney and we can pull what we can, but that will also come with the caveat that it may not be every single provision or amendment. So generally, those would be revealed either through a title examination if there's no active HOA, but if there is an active HOA, they should be providing those amendments as well. So in that instance, you want to make sure it's coming straight from the HOA company. I mean, you can forward them over, but the HOA company is required by law to keep all of that information. Now, again, you can have covenants and restrictions without an HOA. So in that instance, again, you can search public record, but a full title examination is going to be what reveals that.
Do you see us at some point giving visibility to the buyers as far as financials in HOAs? Because some may not have enough reserves or delinquencies that can affect the neighborhood.
Yes. Now, also in this Homeowners Association Act, I mentioned that most HOAs are incorporated as a nonprofit organization. They have to share their financials if you ask for those documents. So you can request, you know, whether you're making a judgment call on this looks like too much or too little, you know, as long as you caveat that with this is just an opinion, I think you'd be okay to kind of talk that through. But you can get all of those financial records and give those over to the client for their own review and opinion forming. And that requirement comes through the Nonprofit Organization Act, but generally when you've got active HOAs, probably 95% of them do fall subject to that, so you can get financial documents. Now it also, and I mentioned this very briefly, in terms of assessments, HOA companies have to provide information about that. The covenants and restrictions will generally spell out how and when you can change assessments, which generally they will give the authority to the HOA company to do that. So, you know, if you sign up for an HOA that's $500 annually, so long as they are changing those according to the covenants and restrictions, you could be subject to one for $1,000 in the future. It's just part of the game. Now, a lot of covenants and restrictions will limit how much they can jump year to year, or will make it pretty difficult to make those assessment changes, but generally they are allowed, but the covenants and restrictions will walk you through that. This new law, the only thing that it does is requires HOA give a 48-hour notice to the property owners prior to the meeting talking about the assessment change. So it doesn't say that they can't do it or they're limited to a certain amount. You just have to have notice. Now, one other kind of little, oh, I skipped my slide here. You might be thinking about zoning laws or other codes that are subject or that a property may be subject to. Sometimes you'll see a property that is subject to covenants and restrictions. There's likely zoning laws or other codes that cover the same issues. In that instance, one does not trump the other. They're going to take the most restrictive of the two, and that will be the standard. A great example of this, we see a lot of questions about short-term leasing. You may have covenants and restrictions that restrict it, or perhaps they do not. So it may say, even in the covenants and restrictions, you can have short-term rentals, but that property may also be zoned in Greenville. In the city of Greenville, there are some residential zones, R6, R9, that you cannot have short-term rentals. So even if your covenants and restrictions say you can, you're still going to be subject to that zoning law. And again, the most restrictive is generally going to be the standard. So covenants and restrictions don't trump or overtake any other codes. Codes don't trump or overtake covenants and restrictions. Which makes it even easier, doesn't it? Now, I think the takeaway here, as you're representing a buyer client, it's important to find them first, read them, ask questions, and if you're not sure, create contingencies in your contract. That can be contingencies for specific use to give you a little more time, or to wait until the title examination comes in. Or again, that due diligence works really well here. So you can, give a little more time to pull those documents and do your homework while you've got the right to unilaterally back out for any reason. But again, that contract generally, unless you've got another reason to back out, covenants and restrictions may not be a good enough reason just because you didn't know about them or you don't like what they say. Now that is everything that I have. I know you guys have been asking questions. I don't know if any of our Zoomers sent some in, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions that you have going on. I think one of the biggest questions that I've seen fairly recently is in regards to those unilateral amendments. I don't like them, but they exist and they can happen. But, you know, at the end of the day, those covenants and restrictions are going to tell you if the developer has the authority to do that, what they can change and how they change it. So again, find them in the very beginning and read them. They're overwhelming sometimes. They're 50 pages. They're generally the same, but most of them, when they're really long like that, will have a good table of content. So if you're worried about one specific item, whether that be the developer having the unilateral authority to change, you can go straight to that amendment section. But again, unless you've got another way out of the contract, generally the first time that the client sees it, you do not want to be during the closing process. Now, yep.
We're done with that thought. You can, it's.
No, go ahead.
Completely unrelated. Okay. So in that scenario where you do not have an HOA, but there are covenants in place from, you know, the 60s or something, and all the people who are on there as, you know, representatives, the mailing address for the Architecture Review Board is completely gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yep.
Who enforces, like, so if there's like a minimum square footage requirement for constructing a home in that neighborhood, and someone is the permit, does the permit office, when they issue permits, do they cross-check those covenants and restrictions? Do they try to enforce it? Or is it up to the homeowners to go and say, this house isn't built to the covenants that were in place, the restrictions?
To answer the permit question, I believe they try their best, but that always comes with restrictions that they don't have. But those people granting permits do not have the authority to enforce these. So in those situations, the only way to enforce is two people subject to that restriction going to court.
Okay.
Now, you will see a lot of those.
So they'll issue a permit for a house like minimum 2,000 square feet, and they'll issue a permit for a house that's 1,500 square feet. They don't care about those restrictions.
I'll try to get an answer to that question. I don't know enough about permitting to know if they are making if they're warranting anything like that.
Makes sense. I mean, they don't have the right to enforce it. It's not, they're not.
Right, so they're kind of almost two separate issues.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, the person giving that permit can't take someone to court and say this doesn't meet.
So it's up to the homeowners to go and.
It's up to the homeowners. Yep, you've got to be subject to the same covenants and restrictions.
Yeah, okay.
In order to enforce them. Now, the chances of that are very slim. You'll find a lot of situations where people live in communities that have covenants and restrictions, and they have no idea they even exist.
Yeah.
So again, chances are slim that your neighbor's going to spend money to bring a lawsuit about, you know, square footage that's been there for 50 years because they're probably going to lose anyway. But yes, you theoretically could enforce it.
Okay.
And even if, you know, you'll see a lot of those, the developer is no longer in business, they'll name the Architectural Review Board, which will be, you know, Joe, Johnny, and Billy, they're all deceased. Those provisions, although it may not be clear on how to, you know, get those back in place, again, even in those situations where no one's around anymore, they still can be enforceable. It makes it very difficult. And again, those are usually very vague. And so even in the event you're taking your neighbor to court, a judge is going to, I don't want to say likely not, but they're going to read those covenants and restrictions very strictly. They are not in the business of telling people what they can and cannot do with their property. The court very much favors the ability to do whatever you'd like, but by law, covenants and restrictions are enforceable. So when they're unclear or vague like that, you know, your chances of prevailing in a lawsuit are mitigated or slim. Any other questions? Well, if you guys have, you guys can call my cell or email me as well. If you have questions on the back end about gathering information or inquiring about covenants and restrictions, just give us a call. And 99% of the time, people know what they're signing up for with an HOA. And generally, covenants and restrictions don't cause a huge stink. But again, if you've got a client that wants to do something very specific with their property, and some clients just do not want any type of restriction, whether or not the likelihood of it being enforced is high or not, they are just against that, they don't want it. So just give us a call. We can help you either do research, create contingencies. But again, big takeaway, you may be subject to those covenants and restrictions once you sign the contract.